Thank you again for your time this morning. This is Matthew Menendez with White Plume. I hope that this webinar will be helpful for you. We're going to be talking, this is kind of a 200 level class, and so what we're going to do today is we're going to start off by just a quick review. A quick review of what the government has done that makes ICD-10 particularly difficult here in the United States. And remember, the goals of what we're trying to do here is, number one, protect your doctor's time and productivity. They have to be able to remain focused on taking care of your patients, generating revenue for the practice. Our providers are the only people that do that, and we need to make sure we protect their time. But at the same time, we do have to balance that with the revenue cycle needs of having the right code the first time. So there's not a lot of costly back and forth between coding and billing staff with the clinical staff to get information, to get claims paid. We want to make sure that we do balance those needs. And then again, the recommendation, as always, is to prepare in advance. The more prepared you can be, the more productive you will be with ICD-10. There will be unforeseen circumstances that you have to deal with any change. That'll be included with ICD-10, but the better prepared you can be, and the more that you can do over the late spring and early summer, the smoother your fourth quarter will be. So I do want to go through some of that review. And then we're going to talk about unspecified codes. There are some new risks associated with unspecified codes in ICD-10. Many people use unspecified codes in ICD-9, and they're not negative consequences for the most part in ICD-9, but there are some of those negative consequences in ICD-10. So we're going to talk about that. And then we're also going to talk about how to identify some of the potential unspecified codes that might be risky for you in ICD-10, how to use your conversion analysis for that, how to use your super bill for that, for those of you who are using Excel capture, to identify some of those, and then how to build custom scenarios into the application to minimize the number of unspecified codes that are actually used, to make sure that you present your providers with the right choices. I'll make sure that we leave plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. Again, feel free to ask any of those questions through the questions panel. Shelley will see those. She'll follow up with you on all of them. We'll answer as many of those today as we can. Also, you can use the questions panel for follow-up requests. If you'd like a copy of the slides, if you'd like a copy of the recorded version of the webinar, if you need help from Shelley on another item, again, feel free to use the questions panel for that, or for any feedback that you have for us on the webinar today. I'll make sure that I try to cover as much of that in the questions and answer session as possible. One caveat before we begin: what I'm going to show you today in the application does require you to be on version 5.1 or higher. The current release is version 5.1.6. We expect that to be the last release prior to ICD-10, so it has all of the ICD-10 functionality included in it. If you are not on version 5.1 or higher yet, do talk with Shelley about that, so that we can get you on the schedule, get you working in that direction, so you can do this advanced prep work, so that you can do the testing prior to the ICD-10 conversion date. Again, if you need to use the questions panel for that, just let Shelley know, and she'll make sure that she gets you that information. But as far as reviewing, what makes ICD-10 so hard, what makes it uniquely difficult here in the United States? I'm sure everybody by now knows that ICD-10 is a one-day conversion, right? It's a Y2K style change. That means there's no transition period, and there's no grace period on the back end. No transition period means on Wednesday, September 30th, you have to use ICD-9 codes. You cannot convert to ICD-10 early. But it also means that there is no grace period. On October 1st, you must start using ICD-10 codes. That's pretty similar to the way that most other countries have transitioned to ICD-10. What makes the transition particularly difficult here in the United States is that this is not our first ICD-10 conversion date. ICD-10 has actually been delayed 3 times already, twice by HHS, and then most recently last spring by Congress. And that uncertainty makes it very difficult for practices to be prepared. Many people put off their ICD-10 planning because they think it's going to get delayed again, and that puts them further behind. It's a lot like the story of the boy who cried wolf, right? The government has lost their credibility on this issue, but if you remember at the end of the story, when the wolf actually comes, the person who suffers, who pays the price, is not the boy, it's the owners of the sheep and the sheep themselves. When ICD-10 arrives, for practices who are unprepared, they can point the finger at the government, but it will be the practice and the providers and the employees of the practice who end up paying that price. And that's why we think it's so important to make sure that you're prepared, and that you're prepared in a way that protects your doctors and your revenue cycle. Because it is going to be a big change for physicians. You've heard us say this before. Most of you are already ahead of the game, ahead of your peers in your ICD-10 preparation, and the difficulty of the change for the physicians is that they cannot slow down. In our current fee-for-service world, our doctors cannot slow down to deal with administrative issues. They must continue to take care of their patients. That's the only way that they can protect their revenue. And for billing managers, for administrators, for project managers in ICD-10, the other difficult part is most doctors aren't particularly interested in ICD-10 either. They wish it would just go away. And so it's difficult to prepare them in a way that is going to protect their productivity but not require very much upfront training for them. That's why we think that's an important part of your strategy, to make sure that you minimize the change for your physicians and make it easy for them to deliver the right code to the billing team the first time. And this is what I think is most difficult about ICD-10 for practices in the United States, is what's at stake. We've had a lot of change in the healthcare community over the past 7 years. PQRS, e-prescribing, meaningful use. All of those were incentive programs where you could earn a bonus for your Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement. ICD-10 is a little bit different. ICD-10 is required for all HIPAA-covered entities, not just Medicare and Medicaid. And there are no bonus dollars available. You cannot earn an extra 2% by complying with ICD-10. If you don't comply with ICD-10, none of your claims will be paid. And again, it's not just about getting claims out the door with ICD-10 codes on them. You have to make sure that they're coded correctly. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about today, how the payers are going to handle that. What happens if I use some of those unspecified codes? Are there negative consequences for me in ICD-10 that I don't have today in ICD-9? Right? We always encourage you to focus on the codes that you use today, and many of you have unspecified codes on your superbills in Excel capture. Many of you use them out of your EHR from time to time. Those unspecified codes exist in ICD-9, and they exist in ICD-10. That's not something that went away with ICD-10. Now the problem is, in ICD-9, unspecified codes are relatively benign. For the most part, they are payable diagnosis codes. And that's not going to be true in ICD-10. There are 2 risks as you transition to ICD-10 if you continue to use unspecified codes: a short-term risk and a long-term risk. Let me talk about the short-term risk first. This is that claims will be denied. If you zoom out from a big picture perspective, trying to look into the future, understand what the payers are trying to do. The payers have advocated and invested in and lobbied for the transition to ICD-10. The reason why is they want the more granular diagnosis codes. They want the more detailed diagnosis information available on their insured populations. That's part of their big data push, which they hope to ultimately use to drive down reimbursement. If the providers do not give them that information, they are going to deny that claim. We have already seen that in the real world in the end-to-end testing that Medicare did in the first quarter of 2015. We have seen that borne out. Now, it's more complex than that. Not all payers are going to handle that the same way or on the same timetable, but they are eventually going to be moving in that direction. And I suspect that they will do that quickly. And that's a risk that you'll face in the fourth quarter of this year, first quarter of next year. Now, there is also a longer-term risk to using those unspecified codes. We are transitioning away from fee-for-service, moving towards pay-for-performance or pay-for-quality. These alternative reimbursement models that you hear the government talks about, we're moving in that direction over the next 3-4 years. In that world, you will need to use the more specific ICD-10 diagnosis codes in order to maximize your reimbursement. In that world, it is all about the expected outcome versus the actual outcome. You have to be able to show how sick your patients are to maximize your reimbursement. The expected outcome is very different for a normal pregnancy versus a high-risk pregnancy due to pre-existing diabetes and lupus and obesity. That's why you'll need the more specific information in order to maximize your reimbursement as we transition to outcomes-based reimbursement. Now, that may be further down the road for some of you than others, but it is still the long-term risk of using those unspecified codes in ICD-10. Now, there will be different people who take different approaches to how they're going to handle this in their ICD-10 strategy. It brings up some difficult questions, and not everybody's going to answer them the same way. You know, the first question is, am I going to be proactive about this? Am I going to try to prevent the use of unspecified codes from day one? Am I going to prevent some unspecified codes but not others? Am I going to I'm just going to use unspecified codes and wait and see what the payers do, and then I'll make a change down the road? These are questions that different practices may disagree on, but I want to make sure that we're giving you this information, that we're educating you so that you make an active decision on this. Because even if you're going to take a reactive strategy, you still need to have your plan B that says, here's what I'm going to do when my payers start denying these claims. Here's how we're going to handle that. You know, the other challenge is, how do I balance the need for my providers to give me good information with their time and not turning them into coders? How are we going to balance that? How are we going to do that? Again, we try to provide you with tools to make that as easy as possible. But how specific are we going to require them to be? And I want to make sure everybody understands this is difficult work of what you need to do over the next few months in order to make sure that your practice is prepared not only to be compliant with ICD-10 but to remain productive in that environment. This is new ground that we're covering. You know, there's some exploration here, because none of you have done ICD-10 before. No practices in the United States have. And the other part that you have to remember is none of your payers have done this before either. They're going to be making changes as they go. So we're going to be in a high change environment for the next 12 to 18 months as people are responding to how the other stakeholders are responding to ICD-10. And there's a lot of gray area, right? It's not all black and white. There's part of this that's science, but there's part of this that's art as well. And there's a balance to that. And what that means is there may be places where reasonable people disagree. Right? You may have one payer who accepts unspecified codes in certain circumstances, and you may have another payer who does not. And the other part that makes this difficult is what's at stake. Because remember, if we're seeing a reduced reimbursement rate, if you're seeing an increase in your denial rate, those are bad outcomes, particularly when there's no additional reimbursement for ICD-10. So where do we start from a practical perspective? Where do we start to answer these questions? I think the best place to start is to look at the codes that you're using today and try to identify which ones of those are unspecified codes that might cause you problems in the future. Right? I think everybody has seen this before, talking about your ICD-10 conversion analysis. You remember we start with the diagnosis codes that you use today. We convert those into ICD-10 codes, right? And then we look at the low-risk codes. Those are the ones that have one code in ICD-9, and they have one code in ICD-10. And I'm going to come back and talk about those because a lot of times clients will skip over that. And there are some unspecified codes that are hiding in that category. So we're going to talk about how to identify those. Okay? And then there are the moderate risk codes. Those are the ones that have between 2 and 10 choices in ICD-10 for each ICD-9 code. And then the high risk codes that have 11 or more. Right? Shelley should have sent all of you your ICD-10 conversion analysis. It should look like this. Let me zoom in, make that a bit bigger for you. Where you've got the summary data up at the top, then you have the line-by-line detail below. That ICD-10 conversion analysis should give you a good indication of the ICD-10 codes that you'll be using. So let me walk through a couple of those examples and point out where there may be some unspecified codes lurking there. Let's look at this first example for diabetes. That code in ICD-9 is one code for either type 2 or other diabetes without complications. That's 2 different codes in ICD-10. Some of you may say we should never use other. We want to take that off our list. We don't want our providers using that. Others of you say, nope, we need to have that as a choice for our providers. Here's one that's a bit more black and white, is laterality. There are a lot of options, a lot of codes that require laterality. And unspecified laterality choices are in lots of the ICD-10 codes. Like look at this one, pain in extremity 729.5. In ICD-10, you have to be more specific to mention not only anatomically which limb are we talking about, but the laterality options are there as well. And I think this is one place where most of our practices agree they don't want to be using those types of unspecified codes. We've made that a configuration setting in version 5.1. You do need to make that decision at upgrade time. But if you want to say, I don't want to show any of those unspecified laterality choices, I can exclude those. I won't show those pop-ups for my providers that are using Excella Capture. Others of you may disagree and say, you know what, I do need to show those unspecified options. Okay, but you'll see that, and again, you'll have the ability to customize those pop-ups. We call those custom scenarios. I'm going to walk through that for you today about how to do that. But you will have an option to customize those. But let's look at this next one. This next one is one of the harder ones to find because it looks like it's not a problem. 428.9, one code, it's I50.9. That can be converted automatically if you want it to. But the problem is that's an unspecified code in ICD-10, and there are more specific options available. You may not want to use that code, or some of you may not want to use that code. So let me walk through why that's showing up as just a one-to-one choice and where the more specific options are and what to do to correct it if you don't want to use that type of unspecified code. All right, on this slide, what you're going to see first are the ICD-10 codes for congestive heart failure. And what you'll see is 428.20 through 43 down at the bottom. Those are all more specific choices for systolic, for diastolic, for both combined systolic and diastolic congestive heart failure. But then you also see the onset. Was it acute? Was it chronic? Was it acute on chronic? Those 13 more specific choices, when we look across our client base, are used much less frequently than the catch-all, the unspecified option. It shows up 4.5 times more frequently on a client's super bills than the specified choices. And there are really two reasons why. Number one, it's a space concern. It's easier to put one code on there than to list out all 13. And number two, for most practices today in ICD-9, the unspecified code is okay. They're not getting penalized from that from a reimbursement perspective. So if there's no negative consequence and it makes the form a bit easier for the provider, that's kind of a slam dunk decision for a lot of practices. But what you'll see is in ICD-10, you've got that same granularity. The unspecified code maps to an unspecified code. And the reason why is we assume in the mapping that you're using the ICD-9 code that you really mean to use. That's the default setting. So if you're telling us that it's unspecified, we're going to assume that it actually is unspecified. And if that's not the case, that's where the custom scenarios are going to come into play. The unspecified code is acceptable for many of you in ICD-9, and I believe for many of you it will be unacceptable in ICD-10. That's why we need to do something to correct that. So let me walk through a couple of scenarios with you, a couple of options with you of what you can do if you have this code or a code like it on your super bill. I'm going to show you how we would handle that in Capture. You need to be thinking about the same thing for those of you who are charge passing clients, for those of you who are capturing that charge data through your EHR. You need to make sure you talk to your EHR vendor about how they're going to handle this. We'll talk about how you can catch it after the fact in Smart, but it's much better to get it right the first time. So for our Capture clients, here's how we'd handle it. You've got three options. Option number one says, you know what? That unspecified code is working for me today. I don't want to change my form. I don't want to revise my form. And I'm okay with converting that automatically to the unspecified ICD-10 code. We're going to try that, see what happens with our payers. We'll make another change later if we need to. There are some people who will adopt that strategy. There are others who say, you know what, we really shouldn't be using those unspecified codes today in ICD-9. We certainly shouldn't be using it in ICD-10. So I'm going to take that unspecified code off of my super bill today, and I'm going to include the 12 additional choices for the more specific ICD-9 diagnosis. More accurate, more precise in your coding. Those are going to be linked to the more specific ICD-10 codes, which is great. But the problem is that requires change from my providers. I'm changing their workflow today. I'm adding codes to their super bill. And if it's just one code and I'm adding 12 codes, this doesn't seem like a big deal. But what if you have 10 of those on your super bill today and you're adding 120 codes? That's a redesign of your super bill that may not be welcomed by the providers. But some of you may choose to pursue that strategy. What I like the best is somewhere in between those that says, if I'm using that code today and it's not causing me a negative outcome in ICD-9, I'm going to leave that on my encounter form. But I don't want to use those unspecified code in ICD-10. So what I'm going to do is create a custom scenario. I'm going to create a custom pop-up so that when I click on that ICD-9 code, the choices that I get include the more specific ICD-10 codes. And you can see I've designed this in such a way, I've organized it in such a way So then I have the type of heart failure along that horizontal axis, systolic CHF, diastolic CHF, combined CHF. And then on the vertical axis, that's where I have the onset. Was it acute? Was it chronic? Was it acute on chronic? So I've organized the new concepts into a way that's easy for my providers to understand and easy for them to select the right code with one click. Now, I did include the unspecified choices on here, on this example, but again, you can customize that pop-up. If you want to take those off, you can. If you want to abbreviate congestive heart failure with CHF, you can do that. We've designed thousands of these custom scenarios that are included, that are built in to the 5.1 version so that you can review those over the summer. You can make changes where necessary to make the transition smooth to ICD-10. Okay, let me show you another example. This time I'm going to talk about osteoarthritis of the knee, right? In ICD-9, that's typically one code, and I've got my options again, right? I'll go through just one more example. I can leave that unspecified code 71596 on there and have that mapped to the unspecified ICD-10 code, right? It mapped directly to unspecified osteoarthritis of an unspecified knee. But again, that ICD-10 code might cause a problem for some of you. Now, in this scenario, I'd only have to add 2 codes to my form, 71516 and 71526. Some of you may be okay with that, some of you may not. If I did that, it would give me the pop-ups with the laterality options for primary osteoarthritis of the knee, 71516, or secondary osteoarthritis of the knee, 71526. Both of them have laterality options, but there are some additional choices for the secondary osteoarthritis. Now I have to be more specific there. Now I've got to be more specific there. Is it post-traumatic or is it an other secondary osteoarthritis? But again, I like the third way the best that says no change for me today. I'm going to tweak that custom scenario so that I've got all the options that I need. All right, now let me walk through that example. Let's go ahead and build a custom scenario. With version 5.1, you've got a new application that's Custom Scenario Editor. It's part of EPAS Support Mate. So it's included in there, and what you'll see in that application, in that window, you've got 2 windows. On the far left, you've got all the ICD-9 codes that we've built custom scenarios for, so that you can see there are a lot of those. On the right-hand side, you see the actual data for the custom scenario. I can always preview that if you want to see the pop-up of what that pop-up would look like. I can click on preview and you can see that. And there are 2 places that those pop-ups come into play in the application. Number 1 is in Capture. When you have an appointment, you have an encounter, that the date of service is after the ICD-10 effective date for that particular insurance. When you click on an ICD-9 code, you will see that pop up. That's part of a setting that's in version 5.1 that allows you to set the ICD-10 effective date for each payer. By default, the date is October 1st, 2015. If you do have any non-HIPAA covered entities, so for the orthopedic practices on the phone, workers' comp, auto collision carriers, you need to ask them, are you moving to ICD-10? If so, when? So that you can change that ICD-10 effective date if necessary. But that's place number 1 where you'll see those pop-ups in Capture. The other place where you can see them, and this may be helpful depending on how some of your EHR vendors are handling ICD-10 for our charge passing groups, you can right-click on an ICD-9 code in Smart and get the ICD-10 pop-up as well. So if any of you have vendors who are still going to send ICD-9 codes, you can see that information in Smart as well. So I like to be able to preview to see what that pop-up is going to look like. let's say that I wanted to make a change. This is not the 71596 example, but let's say that I wanted to make a change here, and I didn't want to spell out osteoarthritis. I want to change that to OA, and I don't want to show the unspecified option. Somehow that got in here. I want to take that off. When I do the preview, you'll see my changes take effect. It's pretty easy to edit a custom scenario if you're just taking something off or changing some of the wording. But what if you've got something that's a bit more complicated, like that 71596, unspecified osteoarthritis of the knee? It's just going to convert to that one unspecified code. So let's go in and make a change to that. Let me show you how the editor works. So here's an example where I might want to create some new rows. So I'm going to add some rows here. And then I'm also going to add some columns for my laterality choices. So I'm going to label that first one left, and let's make the next one right, and I'll make the next one bilateral. We won't do an unspecified version. And then what do I want these labels to be on the vertical axis? Well, the first one I'm going to do is primary OA knee, and then I'm going to go down, and the next one, make that one secondary OA, the knee. I'm going to make that post-traumatic. And then let's also do secondary OA of the knee other. And then maybe I also want to include that unspecified, pardon my typing, OA of the knee. So I've kind of got the framework built, and now I need to go in and put in the actual ICD-10 codes that match up to those column and row labels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on M17.9. It'll open a new dialog box that says, which ICD-10 codes do you want available to put in there? Well, I'm going to just put all the M17s and hit search. And what that does, that lets me say I've got a subset that I can work with rather than working with the entire code book. And the reason we're selecting a code like this rather than typing one in is so that we make sure that they're all valid ICD-10 codes. So for, what was the first one? Primary osteoarthritis of the left knee. I'm going to make that selection M17.12, and you'll see that it puts that in the grid for me. When I go to the next one, I'm going to select the right knee, and it'll put that in the grid for me. I'll select the next one, bilateral primary. Great. Now let's go do the post-traumatic row. There's post-traumatic, but I'm looking for the left knee. It's that one, M17.32. So make that selection, click in the next grid. So I only have to do this one time, and once I get my custom scenario the way that I want it, this is central in the central database so that all of my users have access to the right custom scenario. Once I'm done, I can hit preview. You can see all the results. You'll see if you hover over any individual item, you'll get the code and description there as well. So that's how you go in and make changes and edit a custom scenario if you want to make sure that you customize how that pop-up works. All right? Once you make those changes, you can save it. You'll need to make sure that you save it. If you do try to navigate away from it without saving, it will remind you so that you can make sure that you save those changes. Right? So that's where I think custom scenarios are going to be really important. And what we would recommend doing, thinking about your custom scenarios, they're already loaded and built into the 5.1 release. So you're not starting from scratch on that. Right? Now we're going to assume you are using the right ICD-9 code. So if you have a code that is specifically a closed fracture in ICD-9, we're not going to be showing you all the choices for open fractures in ICD-10. If you want to change away from that default, you can. But that's where the base custom scenarios begin. The ICD-10 conversion analysis that we sent is a helpful tool so that you can go through, you can review those, you can see what's going to be in the custom scenario, you can go into the application, you can review the ones that you use most frequently so that you can make sure that the terminology is consistent with what you'd like, that you have all of the choices that you want, and that you don't have any choices in there that you don't want to use. That's where some of the unspecified codes may come into play. And I would encourage you to review your super bills, review your conversion analysis over the summer, looking for those unspecified codes so that you can make the decision of how you want to handle that, so that you can create the custom scenario for that the third option that I was talking about, for those of you who decide you want to head down that road. Now, for many of you, that may be a bit overwhelming. You may not have the time to do that. You may not have the resources to do that. We are offering custom scenario consulting, so if you need a little bit of extra hand-holding, we can go through and identify those unspecified codes. We'll have a conference call to review those codes, review those options with you so that we understand how you want us to build those custom scenarios, and we can build and deliver those custom scenarios for you as well. If that is something that would be helpful for you, talk with Shelly about it so that she can get you signed up and on the list for that. We only have a certain number of spots for that. We cannot do that for everybody. And we'll have more availability early in the summer as opposed to later in the summer. I think late summer that's going to be in high demand. Right, so just a quick summary, just a reminder of what we've talked about, and then I'll get to the questions and get to as many of them as I can. Yes, ICD-10 is going to be difficult. There are some things that the government has done that make that hard for practices. Most of you are ahead of the game. You're well ahead of what a lot of the other groups that I talk to about ICD-10. Our clients are in very, very good shape. We're very proud to work with you guys on that and make sure that we are preparing you to take care of the big two issues with ICD-10, protecting your doctor's time and productivity, and making sure you can continue to collect on your cash flow without adding additional staff. I think unspecified codes are one of those under the surface risks that a lot of people aren't going to see in advance. That's why we want to talk to you about it, so that you can prepare in advance, so that you can make that decision. And the way that we would recommend doing that is reviewing your most commonly used codes, identifying the ones that are unspecified that may be risky, and making adjustments to those custom scenarios as necessary. If you need our help with that, if you want to do the custom scenario consulting, there's a fee for that, obviously, but we try to use that to get you jump started, do the first 10 for you in that regard. I know I've covered a lot of information. I went through that quickly. Again, I know everybody has Shelly's contact information, but I'll put mine up there as well in case there's anything that I can do to help you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to let me know. But thank you again for your time this morning and for being great clients. It is hugely helpful to work with great clients, and we certainly appreciate that. So I'm going to ask Shelly if we've got any questions that are helpful for the good of the group. I'll try to address as many of those as I can. If there are any that are specific to your practice, Shelly may handle those one-off. But let me see what questions we have from Shelly.